The first number spoken in a negotiation controls the entire conversation that follows. It does this even when that number is completely random and has nothing to do with the actual value being discussed. This is anchoring bias, and the research behind it is almost uncomfortably simple. Researchers once asked people to spin a wheel that was secretly rigged to land on either the number 10 or the number 65. Right after the spin, they asked each person to guess what percentage of United Nations countries are located in Africa, a question that has nothing whatsoever to do with a spinning wheel. People who happened to spin 65 guessed significantly higher than people who spun 10. The wheel had zero actual connection to Africa or the UN. It still shifted almost every single answer, pulling each guess toward whatever arbitrary number had been seen moments earlier. Your brain locks onto the first number it encounters, and then every number that follows gets judged relative to that first anchor, rather than evaluated fresh on its own independent merits. This isn't a rare quirk that only shows up in psychology labs. It's running quietly underneath nearly every negotiation you've ever walked into. Salary negotiations work exactly this way. Whoever names a figure first sets the frame that everyone else in the conversation ends up negotiating inside of, whether they realize it or not. Real estate agents anchor buyers deliberately with a listing price, and from that point forward, every single offer gets mentally compared against that original number, not against the property's actual underlying value, which almost nobody in the transaction has independently calculated. In performance reviews, managers who are shown an ambitious stretch goal before evaluating someone's actual results tend to judge those same results more harshly than managers who were never shown the target at all, even when the underlying performance was identical in both cases. Even experienced, highly skilled negotiators fall for this constantly, which is the detail that should really give managers pause. Studies tracking professional dealmakers found that the final agreed price in a negotiation still tracked closely with whatever the first offer on the table happened to be, not with any independent calculation of fair market value that either side had done beforehand. Expertise didn't cancel the bias out. It just made the negotiators more confident that their final number was rational, when it was still substantially anchored to an arbitrary starting point. Now let's slow down and take this apart properly, because the first number matters undersells exactly how deep this mechanism actually runs. Look at it first through individual psychology. When your brain hears an initial number, it doesn't file that number away neutrally and then go calculate an independent answer from scratch. Cognitive research shows the brain actually anchors its entire search process around that number, generating and testing only nearby values, rather than exploring the full range of genuinely plausible answers. This means the bias isn't just a starting bias that later gets corrected with more thought. More thought spent after hearing the anchor tends to stay clustered near it, because the search itself was constrained from the first number onward. Look at it next through team dynamics. Inside a negotiating team, or inside a hiring committee discussing a candidate's salary, the first number spoken out loud by anyone in the room, even offhand, even meant as a joke or a low-confidence guess, tends to become the group's shared reference point for the rest of the discussion. Later speakers rarely reset the frame entirely. They adjust from whatever anchor already exists in the room, which means the person who happens to speak first, not necessarily the person with the best information, disproportionately shapes where the whole group ends up landing. And look at it through organizational incentive structure. Companies that train salespeople and recruiters explicitly understand anchoring and use it deliberately, setting an opening price or an opening salary range specifically to control where the eventual agreement lands. Meanwhile, most employees walk into the exact same conversations with no comparable training at all, meaning one side of the table is anchoring on purpose, while the other side is anchoring by accident, or worse, being anchored against without realizing it's happening. Now picture a second, completely different workplace scenario to see this play out from another angle entirely. A product team is scoping a new feature, and in the very first planning meeting, an engineer offhandedly estimates it might take about 3 weeks. Nobody validates that number seriously. It was just a rough first guess spoken aloud to get the conversation moving. 2 months later, when the feature is still not shipped, leadership isn't asking, was 3 weeks ever a realistic estimate for this scope of work? They're asking, why are we so far behind the 3-week estimate, treating a number that was never rigorously calculated as though it had been a firm, carefully reasoned commitment. The team spends the rest of the project managing against an anchor that should never have carried that much weight in the first place. Here's a nuance worth being precise about, because it's easy to overcorrect once you understand anchoring. The lesson is not, never let anyone else speak first. Always anchor aggressively in every interaction. Negotiators who anchor with wildly unrealistic opening numbers, hoping to drag the other side toward an extreme, often damage trust and credibility instead of gaining leverage, especially in ongoing relationships like employer-employee negotiations or long-term vendor contracts, where the other party will remember an obviously bad faith anchor long after the deal closes. The actual skill isn't aggression, it's preparation, knowing your own independently calculated number cold before you hear theirs, so that their anchor has less raw material to distort in your head. There's also a deeper wrinkle worth naming about how anchoring interacts with confidence rather than just information. A number delivered with total confidence anchors harder than the exact same number delivered hesitantly, even though the underlying accuracy of the number hasn't changed at all. This means a junior negotiator with a correct number but a nervous delivery can get anchored right past by a senior counterpart with an incorrect number delivered smoothly and fast. Managers coaching junior staff on negotiation often focus entirely on the content of what to say, and almost never on the fact that delivery confidence itself is doing real, measurable work in how strongly an anchor lands. Consider one more comparison, drawn from performance review calibration sessions specifically, since this is where anchoring quietly costs companies the most without anyone noticing. When a calibration meeting opens with someone naming a specific rating for the first employee under discussion, that rating tends to shift the standard used for every subsequent employee discussed in the same session, even employees in completely different roles with no reasonable basis for comparison. Two structurally similar review sessions, differing only in which employee happened to be discussed first, can produce measurably different overall rating distributions purely because of anchor order, not because of any real difference in employee performance. It's worth looking at how procurement teams inside large companies have institutionalized a defense against exactly this bias, because their approach generalizes well beyond purchasing departments. Many procurement processes now require an independent cost estimate to be completed and locked in writing before any vendor quote is seen by the person making the final call. The point of that sequencing isn't bureaucratic caution for its own sake. It's a direct structural countermeasure against anchoring, ensuring that the buyer's own sense of fair value gets established first, uncontaminated by whatever number the seller eventually puts on the table. Teams that skip this step and simply react to whatever the vendor quotes first consistently pay more for functionally identical services than teams that lock in an independent number beforehand, even when both teams end up negotiating the price down from the vendor's initial figure. The same discipline applies directly to freelance and contractor negotiations, a setting where anchoring quietly costs both sides money in opposite directions. A freelancer who names their rate first, confidently, and based on their own calculated value, tends to end up paid closer to that number. A freelancer who waits to hear what the client is willing to pay first almost always anchors downward against a client budget figure that has nothing to do with the freelancer's actual market value. Clients understand this dynamic well enough that some deliberately ask contractors to name a number first, specifically because they know it usually anchors lower than what the client would have offered unprompted. So what does a manager actually do with all of this? Starting with the very next negotiation on the calendar. Set your own number, fully calculated and written down, before you hear theirs. Once you've heard their anchor, your judgment is already contaminated by it, no matter how disciplined you believe yourself to be. So the only real defense is having your independent number locked in first. If you're the one setting expectations for a team, whether that's a project estimate, a budget target, or a performance bar, understand that the very first figure you mention out loud becomes the frame that every subsequent number gets measured against. Fair or not, accurate or not, anchor deliberately and carefully, because if you don't do it on purpose, someone else in the room will end up doing it for you, by accident, with a number nobody actually checked. There's a final layer worth naming, about how anchoring interacts with the passage of time inside a single ongoing negotiation, rather than just the opening moment. Each subsequent counteroffer in a back-and-forth negotiation doesn't reset the anchor. It shifts it slightly, meaning the final agreed number tends to sit somewhere along a path drawn from the very first figure spoken through every increment offered afterward, rather than landing wherever an independent, unbiased calculation would have placed it. This is part of why negotiations that drag on through many small counteroffers often end up further from fair value than negotiations resolved quickly with one or two moves, since each additional round gives the original anchor more opportunities to quietly drag the final number along with it. It's also worth noting how anchoring shapes internal pay equity reviews, an area where the stakes of an uncorrected anchor compound over years rather than resolving in a single conversation. When a new hire's starting salary is anchored to their previous employer's pay rather than to the actual market value of the new role, that anchor doesn't just affect one offer, it follows the employee through every subsequent raise cycle, since most raises are calculated as a percentage increase from the existing number rather than a fresh, independent valuation. A single misanchored starting figure can compound into a meaningfully larger pay gap 5 years later, even if every individual raise along the way was calculated fairly relative to that flawed starting point. Consider one more scenario, drawn from internal budget negotiations between departments rather than external deals. When a finance team reviews department budget requests each year, the department that submits its number first, especially if it does so early and confidently before other departments have staked out their own asks, often shapes the overall tone of how generously the whole budget cycle gets treated that year. A department that asks last, after finance has already anchored on a tighter number from an earlier, more conservative request, tends to receive less even when its underlying case is objectively stronger. Savvy department heads learn to submit early and confidently for exactly this reason, understanding that budget cycles reward anchoring position as much as they reward the substance of the request itself. One more distinction worth making explicit here too. Anchoring is not the same thing as simple persuasion, and treating it that way leads to sloppy countermeasures. Persuasion works by changing what someone believes about the actual value of something. Anchoring works even when the person consciously knows the anchor is arbitrary and irrelevant, which is exactly what the spinning wheel study demonstrated. People who were told outright that the wheel was random still had their guesses pulled toward whatever number it landed on. This means simply telling your team, ignore the vendor's opening price, it's just a tactic, does almost nothing to neutralize the effect, because conscious awareness of an anchor doesn't meaningfully reduce its pull. The only reliable countermeasure is establishing your own independent number before exposure to theirs, not willpower applied after the fact. If you've caught yourself negotiating against a number you never actually verified, hit follow. It's worth adding one more distinction between an anchor set deliberately by a skilled counterpart and one that arrives by accident, say from a public salary database or an old budget line someone forgot to update. Both produce the same psychological pull, but only one of them was placed there with intent, which means the fix looks different each time. Against a deliberate anchor, naming it out loud often breaks its power, while against an accidental one, simply replacing it with better information usually does the job. Worth also considering how anchoring interacts with silence itself, not just with numbers spoken aloud. A negotiator who says nothing after stating a number is unconsciously using the discomfort of silence as leverage, because most people rush to fill quiet moments with a counteroffer or concession they hadn't fully thought through. The anchor doesn't need extra words to keep working, it just needs the other side to feel the pressure to respond quickly, and quick responses under social pressure are exactly the conditions where anchoring has the most room to operate unchecked. Because untangling exactly which of your own past decisions were shaped by an anchor versus real judgment is a habit worth building one story at a time. One more angle worth adding, about how anchors compound when multiple people negotiate in sequence rather than all at once. A hiring manager who hears one candidate's salary expectation early in a search often carries that number, consciously or not, into every subsequent conversation that week, even with candidates whose skills and market value are completely different. The first number anyone says out loud in a hiring cycle can end up quietly setting the frame for every offer that follows, regardless of whether that first candidate was even a strong fit.